everybody, and welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. This podcast is brought to you today by Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. I'm Jasmine Paha.
And I'm Margot Eichenberg. We're recording today from McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work individually and as a university community on these lands. Welcome to episode 4 of our mini-series on assessment and well-being. When we talk about healthier learning environments in university settings, the well-being of students and instructors is in play. And when we hone in on assessment, we can be all the more sure. Having their learning assessed and translated into grades matters a great deal to students and can be either a source of accomplishment or frustration and disappointment, or both. On the instructor side, too, carrying out assessments that focus on learning, are fair, and don't overwhelm the grader is a difficult balancing act. And often left out of this conversation are graduate students. This despite their crucial intermediary roles between undergraduate students and instructors. Not to mention that they continue to be students and sometimes even instructors themselves. Today, we've invited 2 graduate students to the show to examine how assessment and well-being are related in their context.
Today, we're joined by Connor Chan and Sakina Rizvi. Connor is a second-year Master's of Information Studies student at McGill. He's interested in librarianship and user experience and is conducting research about how knowledge acquired from online communities is used offline. In particular, he is investigating lurking as an aspect of a professional's information and knowledge-seeking strategy. He's also a student assistant at Teaching and Learning Services. In his free time, he enjoys board games ranging from Lost Cities to Everdell. Sakina is a PhD student in the Department of Integrated Studies at Education at McGill University. Her doctoral research is centered around understanding the relationship between self-development and accelerative learning pathways. She's a passionate educator who has experience as a course lecturer and a teaching assistant, in addition to her work in supporting events offered by McGill's Teaching and Learning Services. In her free time, Sakina loves to go ice skating, hiking, and traveling. A few years ago, she went all the way up to the Arctic Ocean. Welcome, Connor and Sakina. We're so happy to have you here with us today. So let's dive right in. Let's begin with your thoughts on assessment and well-being and being asked to talk about these 2 things together. Is this a conversation that you've had before?
Well, in my case, it's not. I think that instructors have from time to time offered a little bit of advice at the beginning of the semester, said that I'm available if you have any needs for support. But beyond some small remarks like that, it's not really a conversation that I've had on campus.
Yeah, I think Connor's right. I think it's often something that a lot of people aren't aware of. But when I was teaching, just in conversations with students, it is clear that there's a lot of association between their identity and the grades that they get. And that really ties into this well-being piece that we'll be revisiting, I think, a couple of times in our discussion. So definitely something that doesn't happen as much as it should.
Thanks so much, Connor and Sakina. I'm really excited to have you on the show today. And I think this is that could be potentially the beginning of many other conversations. And we really hope that that's one of the goals that we can meet with our podcast. I wanted to ask Sakina now about the role of TAs specifically. So when we think about teaching and learning, we know that the responsibility falls on the instructor. But TAs play these really key intermediary roles between instructors and students. They're often discussion leaders, they can supervise lab work, and often grade assessments themselves. So what would you say, Sakina, makes for a good experience in assessing students as a TA?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I would say probably one of the most important things is going back to the way that the assessment is created. As a TA, you often have to mark, could be between 50 to 100 assessments, sometimes even more, depending on the sections that you're responsible for. So if an assessment is created well, and if you have a clear marking criteria, it really makes your job easier compared to when, you kind of have to figure things out on the go, or there isn't that clarity. That also increases the chances of student complaints or inconsistency in marking. So I would say really the first thing is, having a good structure for the assessment, a good rubric or marking criteria. And the second thing would be, if the TA really has a good relationship with the course coordinator or instructor, that'll help them, kind of overcome any knots or issues that come along the way. And knowing that the TA can go to the instructor is something that can be a source of comfort. And then lastly, being able to discuss anything with the students. So if I'm marking an assignment and there's something I'm confused about, being able to reach out to a student, get some clarification. This can ensure that the student understands why they got the grade that they did. And as a TA, you feel a lot more confident in your marking process.
Thanks so much. Those are some really great tips. You really sound like you've thought this through, and absolutely. Like I love the fact that you both think about the relationship with the instructor and with students, because finally that's what an intermediary does. It makes sense that both of those relationships have to be running smoothly, and the fact that there's good communication and clarity about expectations of how the assessment's going to take place makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask now a little bit about what you conceive of, or what, from your perspective, would be well-being in undergraduate students. So, for example, you usually interact with a lot of students as a TA, and what would you say causes intense stress and maybe even anxiety around assessments for undergraduates? And would you say that the stressors for graduate students are similar?
A lot of the anxiety and stress comes from either the weightage of the assignment. So knowing that there's this assessment that's worth 30 or 40% of your mark. And the reason you're stressed about it is because it's going to determine, your GPA, which is going to influence your admissions decisions if you want to get into a master's program or if you want to do kind of something after. So I would say a key kind of area of stress for undergraduate students is that they really associate the grading process and the assessments with success in their life. So if I'm not going to do well in this course, then I'm going to be a failure. What am I going to do next? There's a lot of doubt about, what's going to happen if this doesn't work out? And because there's this association between the grades and my success as an individual, I start to tie in sort of anytime that I get a bad mark with feelings of anxiety and stress and doubt and similar sorts of thoughts. And I would say it's very similar for graduate students as well, because of course, when you get to graduate school, you're still thinking about scholarships and you're thinking about post kind of doctoral opportunities or post-master's opportunities. And so I think, one of the tough things when you're in this sort of position where you associate your grades with your identity is it becomes very hard to separate the two. And so I think having this conversation about well-being, one of the key things is to realize that, your identity and who you are is so much more than, the numbers that you might get on a piece of paper.
I can relate to that as being a student not that long ago and chasing those grades, which, Margot is going to touch on in a little bit. But there is another recommended practice that we would like to touch on that helps ensure fair, reliable, and equitable assessment practices are that instructors' expectations are clearly communicated to students. So having a kind of clarity can provide students with predictability and structure, which can mitigate stress. But what's clear to instructors might not always be clear to students. So Connor, what in your experience is implied when we say things like instructors should clearly articulate what students need to earn those grades?
So I think it seems implied in that sense that there are ways in which an instructor can unclearly articulate what they're expecting out of students. And I think understanding that the first time that an instructor provides their expectations, the guidelines of that it might not necessarily make sense to students. Well, it makes perfect sense in the mind of an instructor. And so I would hope that for any instructors that are, whenever they're handing out, guidelines or rules, that they have this mindset of being open and transparent with their students, and that they're willing to set aside some time to talk through the guidelines, to provide more clarity, to answer their questions. And I know that requires some time, whether it's in class or during office hours, but I think that it will have a big impact in terms of like the students' learning and also on the output of their work as well. And this could also come in the shape of like providing examples of past successful work that the professor has liked, just as a more kind of concrete example of what they're expecting from their students.
How do you think, or in what ways can clarity in assessments contribute to positive learning experiences? So when students really know what they're supposed to be doing and are given kind of that more predictable structure for assessments.
I think part of the way that clarity can help with the assessment is in the instructor making it clear why they're doing the assignment. I think there have been classes that I've done in the past as an undergraduate or as a graduate, and I'm like, why am I being asked to do this? Like, what's the point? And, when your goal as a student is to, get a job afterwards or go to higher education, sometimes the assessments that you're being asked to do, it just doesn't make sense to you. So I would hope that instructors are able to provide a little bit more clarity in terms of like, this is the assignment that I'm giving you. This is what I expect. But also this is how I think it relates to the bigger picture of like what your goals are. And because I think that assessments also provide an avenue for students to take the theory that they're learning in class and translate it into something practical. And that in and of itself is, I think, can be a positive learning experience. because I can't, like, I know that there's a lot of times where I'm listening to the professor and, I understand the material that they're saying, but it's not really until like I sit down and I start to prepare a presentation or I prepare a report that the material really clicks and I understand where the challenges are, what the problems that I need to solve are. And I think that's a very fruitful learning experience. So I hope that more assessments can offer that to students, because I know things like a multiple choice exam aren't necessarily the best kind of avenues for exploring that kind of learning.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, we meet with instructors often and we talk about course design and designing their learning outcomes to have on their syllabus at the beginning of a term. And often they're just there and they're not really talked about. And so it reminds me that it is important for instructors to kind of communicate those learning outcomes to the students and tell them exactly what's expected of them and then how each assessment can help them achieve those learning outcomes of the course. So with that, then what would you say are ways that we can ensure that the grades at the end of term or at the end of an assessment are fair and reliable?
Yeah, I think Connor and Jasmine, even yourself, you kind of touched on this in the discussion that you just had, which is that it really goes back to clarity. When we were talking earlier about why students feel stress and anxiety, I think one of the things I forgot to mention is just that they don't know what to do, that you look at an assignment and you're confused about where you should start, or you put a lot of effort into it and the effort doesn't equal the grade. So when we talk about fair and reliable grades, I think one of the most important things is to ensure that, there's clarity in the way that the assignment is communicated, clarity in the way that the marking criteria is developed. But then lastly, also really ensuring that whatever the assessment is, it reflects the same kind of difficulty level and the same content that's been discussed in class. So I can recall, moments as a student where everything makes sense in class, but then you go to the assignment or you go to the exam and it feels like it's coming from a completely different sort of space. So to make sure that things are fair, it's really important for us to, as instructors, or if you're in a position of a TA, to make sure that the difficulty level is matched between what's going on in class and then what the students have to take away at home. And then also providing, especially if it's a big assessment, sort of something like a midway check-in. If it's an assessment that's like worth 40%, to just have it being submitted in one go can make students feel, very overwhelmed. So if it's possible to do a midway check-in, some kind of outline just to break that up a little bit, I think it would really make the process transparent. And then, of course, give students the opportunity to receive a little bit of feedback before they actually submit their work.
And I think I would add to that is I think that obviously the idealistic view is that everything should be clear and students should know, exactly what's expected of them. But what if it's not clear? Right. And I think that there should be some mechanisms after the fact for students to meet with their professor and say, hey, I thought this is what I was expected to do. Apparently it wasn't. Can we talk about that? Right. Not in the sense of they want to, dispute the grades or anything like that, but for them to understand how is it that they can take their learning and advance it to the next level for future assignments or future kinds of assessments. Because I also think that, there's the pieces of that question was also about fair and reliable. And I think that instructors are people too. And sometimes they do make mistakes. And, it's happened in the past where a multiple choice exam, an instructor entered in the wrong answers on a Scantron, answer key, and it marked a bunch of people's grades wrong. And obviously, I don't think that is either an indication of fair and reliable grades. But, had that professor not been open to receiving office hours and having students review their exams and the answer keys, then that kind of mistake might have gone unnoticed. So I think it's important as well that students have that opportunity to have that dialogue with their instructors.
I can't agree more. And I think I'm going to add something that touches on sort of the undercurrent of what we've been talking about, but we haven't said it explicitly. And that's the relationship between assessment and learning, because we do focus a lot on grades. And there are reasons for that. As Sakina's expressed them really well, just in the short time we've been talking on this podcast. So assessment for learning, we know, is something that should allow for a fair, meaningful, and effective assessment of students' learning. And this is what we're aiming for in a higher ed context today. We want a learning environment that's both healthy and rigorous. And it helps determine whether the learning outcomes that Jasmine was just talking about are achieved, right? When the assessment for learning is happening in such a way that the assessment task is addressing the outcome, like Connor said too, right? I need to know why I'm doing this and what learning am I supposed to be getting out of it. Those things make sense to us, and it's really hard to argue with any of that. But how do we reconcile assessment for learning in a system that encourages chasing grades? Because students are taught, and not just in higher ed, this happens much earlier, that grades matter most. So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, this is, of course, a really big issue. And I think it's not an issue that, any one institution or one place faces. It's an issue that we kind of need to resolve within education as a whole. So it's definitely a systemic issue. But I think that there are ways for us to make changes in the small spaces that we have influence in. So taking kind of the perspective of an instructor or TA, there are a lot of ways that instructors and TAs can make sure that their classroom space is one where this sort of ideology isn't present. And, this really goes into making sure that students know that they can communicate concerns, structuring assessments in a student-centered way, really looking at, this assessment should be designed to improve student learning as opposed to, getting them to memorize large, amounts of content, really taking a step back and asking, what's the best way for me to test the student? Of course, you want to test students' learning, but do it in a way where it's holistic and not just sort of about, content regurgitation. And then from the student perspective, I would say one of the biggest things is to really reframe the attitude and approach that we have towards learning. So we have to stop looking at grades as the end. We really have to reconceptualize the way that we approach learning to say that, I'm not learning this so that I can get into X graduate school, or, my entire goal for this course isn't just to get an A. I'm learning to better myself. I'm learning to gain new skills, which are going to help me in the future. So having a kind of better long-term perspective is something that can help dismantle this kind of race that we have with grades. And when you begin to see learning as a long-term process and you begin to develop a higher purpose for why you're doing so, it's much easier to develop a higher level of motivation for what you're doing, while also having stronger levels of, mental well-being, because you've now disassociated from tying your worth to the grades that you're receiving.
Yeah, so I think Sakina really hit the nail on the head there. I'm not sure how much else I can add, but I do want to kind of focus on the piece that I think that a lot of students that I know and that I've talked to, like they see grades as being part of one of the goals that they might have. And I think that a lot of people are pursuing a university education because they see that it's something that will open up doors for them. And so grades are the thing that allows them to get the degree, and then the degree allows them to get some job that they want or in order to get the graduate school. And obviously there's some problematic elements to that, as Sakina has mentioned. But I think that also causes a bit of I want to say like adversarial connection to assessment, where it's like, okay, I got to get through this final exam, or this final exam is standing in the way of me getting the degree, which is standing in the way of me, getting the job that I want, right? And so I think that reframing assessments, or that instructors could help to reframe assessments or to pivot assessments in terms of being, okay, it's less of a barrier to you getting what you want, and more of, this is something that's going to help you along the way, right? Like this project, this exam, this knowledge that you're getting by doing this assessment. Yes, it's for me in order to assess how much content you're learning, but also it's to assess, or also it's to allow you a learning opportunity so that you can better your skills for whatever ultimate goal is that you have, whether it's to find a job or to go to graduate school, to do research, that sort of thing.
So I feel like one of the big themes that we're talking about today, which is tied in with strategies like giving feedback and being flexible, is really humanizing the teaching and learning experience and using more of these inclusive practices in teaching. So Sakina, a while ago, you talked about even making changes in attitude by the student and even by the instructor. And we also talked about the importance of communication and just being honest. So whether it's being honest as a student that you didn't understand something correctly after the fact, and then maybe even being honest as the instructor if you made a mistake, like the multiple choice example that you gave a while ago, Connor. And this brings me to think about values. So what are some values, and you can even touch on some of the practical changes that instructors can incorporate to create a space where open discussion and dialogue about their assessments is welcome?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And as you said, Jasmine, it really goes back to the kind of culture that we create in our classrooms. I know for myself, like when I was teaching, sometimes it's hard to break out of the mindset that we've grown up in associating marks with success for students. So sometimes that reconceptualization is something that even instructors have to do as well. And so when we talk about values, I think it's really important to set a culture in the classroom that is not just grades, not just like grades oriented. And by that, I don't mean to say that we don't care about grades at all. But that we really give the students a bigger picture for their learning. So I've had some friends, not from McGill, tell me stories of walking into class and professors saying things like, I just want you to look around and really remember the people next to you because they probably won't be here in 2 weeks. They would have dropped out. Or, I just want to let you know that 90% of you will fail in the program. right? So when we kind of say these kinds of things, it really feeds into this grades-driven culture. So in the opposite way, really starting off class by saying, I'm not out to get you. I remember when I was teaching, I just told the students that I'm not trying to cut marks for you. So help me make you successful. It's not the case that I'm really looking for mistakes or trying to make sure that everyone gets a 50 in the class. So I think just making some of those statements really helps students know their instructors are there to facilitate their success and are there to really help them reach their goals. And then in terms of a practical change, I think one of the best ways to create this open environment is to allow for co-creation. And of course, this will vary depending on the size of the class, but allowing students to share their thoughts for assessments and for rubrics. So I've had classes as a student where, we were a class of maybe 20 or 30, and we co-created the rubric together. And that, really was a great experience because we created it, we were very clear about what we had to be marked on. And in the process of creating it, it was also something where we could ask questions. And, in many ways, I think it also helps the instructor. We were talking earlier about, whether it's a burden or it's hard for instructors to kind of take some of these changes on. There are ways to add in these values by placing some of the load on the students and doing it in a way that it isn't just one person kind of taking everything on. So when we talk about values and practical changes, I think one of the most important things is really interacting with students in a relational manner where it's not a top-down hierarchical approach. It's really something where, the student and the instructor is part of a process where you're co-creating knowledge together as a community. And if you can really ingrain that sort of understanding in the classroom, interestingly, the grades will follow. Like if you can get your students to love learning, if you can get your students to be motivated, they will get the A's in the end, right? But if you're not able to create that motivation and that passion, then eventually, things will fizzle out in the long run.
That is a great response. I think that making little changes is super important and creating that culture where students are a part of they feel like they have agency in the learning experience. So co-creating a rubric, for example, is like they really have some control about what they're going to get out of it. So I think that's really interesting and really important and definitely would foster more motivation for students to learn. So even with that, though, sometimes instructors may find that opening a dialogue about assessment with their students difficult. So whether it's a matter of carving out the time, practically within the lecture, or it's a matter of them being kind of rigid in their assessment strategies that they've already determined and being a little bit apprehensive about co-creating a rubric, it can happen. So how can we find a balance so that we integrate some of the practices that we've mentioned today? So whether it be setting clear expectations, having more flexibility, or having those well-designed rubrics without overburdening instructors or TAs?
For sure. I think this is a really important question. And I think there's a misconception that accounting for well-being requires this sort of complete revamp of everything that an instructor has already planned for. But really, it's something that you can bring into your classroom through very small changes that are integrated easily. So if we remove kind of assessment changes or kind of practical things like that, just changing the language that you use can make a huge difference. So making sure that in the first class, just saying that I'm here to facilitate your success. Positioning yourself not necessarily as somebody who is an authoritative, hardcore grader, but somebody who is there to help the students along the way. I think if you position yourself in that manner, you've already set the tone for making the changes that you want. And then when we talk about, assessments, one of the things that's been helpful for me, and I learned this from one of my instructors and then brought it into my course, was one of my instructors. She had this sort of token in her class where she said, anytime in this semester, you can use this to get a 2-day extension on your assignment. She said, you don't have to explain to me what's going on. Just whenever you want to use it, we had an option to kind of, select it in our online course page. And, life happens, things go on. And I know a lot of students, including myself, really respected that and really found that helpful. All right. So just accounting for the fact that students are human, that they are also on a process of growth and that we can't hold them to these high expectations that in many cases are unachievable. When you're teaching a class, you will have students from varying backgrounds. And so doing these kind of small changes through our language, through showing consideration for the other responsibilities and circumstances that students are going through is something that will allow them to be much better learners in our class without overburdening kind of the job that we already have to do in terms of, preparing for lecture or creating content. And I know, Margot, when we were discussing something earlier, you had mentioned that when you were teaching, just really checking in with your students at the beginning of class, just saying, especially during COVID, I know a lot of instructors did this, like asking the students, how are they doing? Because again, we really want to bring back this human aspect in learning, that they're not just assignment producing machines. They're people who have lives and families and responsibilities outside of the class. So taking maybe 5 minutes at the beginning or 5 minutes at the end to do a quick check-in can be something that really instills that kind of community culture.
Yeah, that's very true. And like you said before, it's like kind of establishing the instructor-student relationship as more of a partnership rather than a kind of top-down approach where the instructor is the one in power and students are there to cater to them. Like, no, students are really there to get an education and then go out into the real world with these skills. So it's kind of important to take a step back and remember that this is a partnership. So we're going to start wrapping up, and we're going to go back to touch on what we kind of started the episode with. So earlier we asked you if you had conversations regarding the relationship between assessment and well-being. And we also explored why we think some of these conversations are not happening. So like we're having the conversation today, which I think is a really good step. What do you feel are ways that we can begin to have more of these types of conversations on university campuses about the relationship between assessment and well-being and the conversation between faculty and students in this regard?
So I think that, as like Sakina mentioned, and that like the instructor really sets the tone of the culture in the classroom. And I think it really makes a difference in terms of what I feel somewhat like intimidated by the course, or if I feel, okay, this might be a bit of a challenge, but the instructor is there. They've got my back, and I'm going to be happy to, talk to them if ever I have any concerns. And so I think like the key piece there is feeling that the instructor is there, is present, but also is willing to listen to me, and then also that I'm willing to listen to them and to engage with them. One of the things that I think we didn't really touch on, but I think is really valuable is about how students can support each other through the learning process. And I think that instructors really have a role to play in terms of setting the parameters of that up to connect students with each other. Because I think university life, especially for those where they're away from home, it's isolating, right? You might not know anybody. You might not have any friends yet. And for the instructor to have avenues to say, okay, I'm going to maybe set you guys up with some study groups if you'd like, that sort of thing, right? To facilitate those introductions between students so that they can either study together or share notes or just to support themselves throughout the process of assessment. I think that could be a role that instructors can do, and they don't even need to necessarily insert themselves in that process where they might not necessarily feel comfortable, right? And they can let the students help themselves.
Just one thing to add would be that in order to know that we need to have more of these conversations on campus, we have to realize and have an awareness that this is an issue. I think a lot of people, instructors, TAs, even students, don't realize that this is something that needs to be addressed. I mean, you only have to go to, walk by a classroom where there's an exam happening and see some of the students outside, and you'll see everyone has like dark circles and bags under their eyes, and they're in sweatpants and frustrated and nervous and stressed. And so this is something that, is not just restricted to one department. Students across departments, across universities are definitely struggling with dealing with this relationship between assessment and well-being. So I really think the first step is awareness and understanding that this is something that we need to talk about a lot more.
Sakina and Connor, thank you so much for your insights. Really listening to you has been enlightening. And we really hope that, as you mentioned, that these conversations can begin to happen more and more. I think absolutely their awareness about assessment and well-being and how they match up is something we need more of. And we also have to feel more comfortable talking about it. I think it's, like I mentioned at the beginning, assessment ideally really should be this place where instructors and students come together to share similar ideas about learning, and yet it turns into something quite negative and stress-inducing, and therefore delicate as a topic to discuss. So I think that just having a conversation, and like you've said in many of your interventions, these small things that can be done to begin the conversation and to walk through it, talk through it, think through it, as we do in higher ed, can be just really helpful. So before we end for today, I wanted to ask you if there was anything else that you wanted to add that we've left out and you think is worth adding to the end of our podcast. And also feel free to share what a tip for our listeners. It can be anything of your choice.
I think my tip would be to really find your why and to have a deeper why. And what I mean by that is to really have a bigger purpose behind what you're doing. And I don't mean to spark an existential crisis, but, really, I know personally for me, this has been very helpful, is taking a step away from the grades and understanding and asking myself, why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm paying so much money, I'm spending so much time. There has to be a reason for why I'm doing this outside of just, trying to get a grade and get a job. And this purpose could be related to service. It could be related to, any kind of goal that you have. But it's really important to understand your purpose, to have a deeper reason for why you're doing things. And if you can, it can be a journey in terms of understanding and identifying what that is. But if once you're able to do so, I think it becomes a lot easier to, deal with moments where you do get a bad grade. You don't necessarily see that as the end, but you say, okay, you know what? This is just part of my journey. It's something that I'm going to learn from. I'm going to get back up again. I'm going to continue because I have this greater goal in mind. So I would say, for those who are listening, really thinking about some of these things can help alleviate, stress, anxiety, and the frustration that we traditionally associate with grades and assessments.
I know, Connor, that you like to play board games. So maybe you have a tip for us in that regard for alleviating stress.
I think board games are sometimes very stressful, honestly. Like they can be very taxing. I've had lots of discussions about board games with some friends. But, I think that this conversation has reminded me a little bit about my past life as a business student. And in operations management, which we studied, there's this principle of Kaizen, which is having small incremental changes will lead to big changes. And that's in the context of like operations management, right? But I think that whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in your life, just making a small change like every day can lead to something big at the end of it. And I encourage everybody to take that kind of mindset, that it only takes you 3 seconds to decide to do something, or maybe even just to do that one thing. And hopefully at the end of it, through continuous efforts, that'll lead to something. So I encourage everybody to consider that.
I love that. And I think that both of those tips, even though they might have been geared to students, especially Sakina, thinking of finding your why, I think that applies to all of us. And I think that applies to instructors too, and taking a step back and remembering your purpose as an educator and your purpose of guiding students to achieving, whatever outcome it is that they want. But yeah, I think those are really great tips. So thank you. And thank you both so much for being here. It's always really wonderful to hear from students. I usually deal with faculty. Anytime I've had the opportunity to deal with students and hear their perspectives have always been really, really interesting. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. And be sure to watch out for the next episode of Teach, Learn, Share, in which we continue to discuss assessment, equity, and well-being from different perspectives in higher education contexts. Feel free to subscribe to this podcast and share with your colleagues. Until next time.